There's not a lot of bright spots when your family sells you into slavery in a place far away from anywhere you've ever known. Not a lot of bright spots when you have no way of sending word back to your father, who surely would undo what your jealous brothers have done. Not a lot of bright spots when you don't have any written word of God that you can consult, even though they probably would have taken it away when they enslaved you. And you don't have any direct communication with God. You don't have any really substantial revelation of even who God is at this point in the history of the world. And so you don't have a whole lot of concrete evidence to stake your faith on, even though you still have that faith. Not a lot of bright spots. Not a lot to go on. Not a lot to keep you from spiraling into depression, into just kind of a whatever happens, happens, I'm just going to make the most of it, but there's not much I can do about it. That's the situation that Joseph finds himself in our text for this morning in Genesis chapter 39. He's enslaved in Egypt. And by the way, Egypt at this point is no small nation. They are the ruling power of this part of the world. In many cases, one of the predominant empires in the entire world. It's not like you're going to easily escape from bondage to this people. There's not a whole lot he has to go on. But he has some good fortune. As we know, Joseph, he does hold on to his faith, even though, compared to what we have now, it seems like he doesn't have a whole lot to go on for his faith. He is to be admired for that fact. And so he would see this, I'm sure, as an act of God. He is bought by an individual in Egypt who actually treats him, it seems, with a degree of fairness. Doesn't treat him cruelly, by all accounts. Recognizes his talent, recognizes what he is capable of, and ends up, over the course of, we're not exactly sure how long, but ends up putting him in charge of his household. This would most likely mean that Joseph was in charge of the other slaves, because Potiphar certainly would have had other slaves, being the type of man he was, a well-to-do man in Egypt. He would have had other slaves. Joseph would have been kind of in charge of them, the overseer of them, making sure they were fulfilling their duties as well. He would have been in charge of some of the, business ventures of Potiphar, probably overseeing the trade of the goods that he was able to produce from his fields and so forth. In fact, we're told that it got to the point where Potiphar trusted Joseph so implicitly that the only thing he really worried about was what he had to eat. And the only thing he kept from Joseph in terms of what he was in charge of, if you will, was his own wife. But of course, it's always that one thing that gets you, right? Joseph is seemingly doing as well as possible in the situation that he has been put in. Maybe now there's a glimmer of hope. Again, credit to Joseph. He seems to have had hope all along, despite what most of us, I feel like, probably would have felt like, or at least wanted to feel like. But it's that one thing that came back to bite him. Not that he had done anything wrong, but the one thing that Potiphar kept from him is the one thing that was set on getting him in trouble. You see, Joseph was a handsome young man. We're not exactly sure how old he was. We're not exactly sure how old Potiphar's wife was. We're not really told much about Potiphar's wife, except she saw Joseph and said, "Ooh la la." She wanted him. She wasn't satisfied for whatever reason with Potiphar. It's possible, given the ancient customs of the day, that she was about Joseph's age and Potiphar was way older. We don't know that, but that wouldn't have been unusual for this time period. It's possible that she was just not a very moral woman. It's possible that, well, all sorts of things are possible, right? We could come up with all sorts of scenarios. Bottom line is, she wanted Joseph. Now, I want you to think about the position this puts Joseph in. Joseph is a slave. Joseph doesn't have any prospects of not being a slave any longer. I'm not aware, and someone might be able to correct me on this, I'm not aware in ancient Egypt of any normal processes for getting out of slavery. That was the case in Greek and Roman culture, for example. It wasn't uncommon to eventually buy your way out of slavery, but I'm not aware of any such custom in Egypt. But now his master's wife has taken a liking to him. Kind of a creepy liking, we can understand, but still. What is Joseph going to do? Well, Joseph's response, once again, shows his character. He recognizes not just that this would be a betrayal of his master, and from our perspective looking on, why do you owe your master anything? You're a slave taken against your will. Why do you owe him anything? But nonetheless, Joseph not only recognizes it would be a sin against his master, it would be a sin against God. A God whom, despite what people might try and convince Joseph of, Joseph does not believe has abandoned him. And so Joseph says no. But it's not like he can leave the environment. It's not like he has any choice to get out of this situation. He's a slave in the household. He's going to be around Potiphar's wife. And so most of us have heard the story. She keeps on and on and on. Potiphar's not in the house, and every time she sees him, come on, you know, it won't be that big a deal. I'm your master's wife, so technically I'm basically your mistress as well. Let's make this happen. And he still says no. Can't help but think of a relative down the road many generations of Joseph who would have a similar instance. Constant nagging by a woman, and Samson would give in. But Joseph never does. So eventually, one time when there's no one in the house, not Potiphar, not the slaves, not anyone, this woman grabs on to Joseph's garment, trying to essentially force him, as much as she's able, to lie with her. And Joseph, he's out of there. Leaves his garment and runs. And of course, Potiphar's wife at this point is just upset more than anything, and so she accuses him of trying to assault her. And Potiphar, as a result, puts him in jail. There's nothing about this that seems like a winning scenario. Nothing about this that seems like Joseph has a good option. Now, I understand in the story, true story, of course, but in the story, there is a good outcome. Eventually, because he's in prison, Joseph will find his way before the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, and he will be able to interpret a dream for him and be put in second in command in the empire, because it was pretty much an empire at that point under Egypt. That's a good ending, but Joseph doesn't know that's going to happen. Joseph has no idea. From purely a human standpoint, the situation he's put in as Potiphar begins to make her, or Potiphar's wife rather, begins to make her advances, this is a lose-lose scenario in every possible way. Yes, there is a right thing to do, don't misunderstand me, but neither scenario is going to turn out well, at least not from a human perspective. Let's explore what we mean by that. What happens if, as he does, Joseph says no? And I want us to be thinking, as we're looking at Joseph, not just confining ourselves to Joseph's situation, but what happens when I'm in a similar situation? When someone puts me in a situation where I have two options and neither of them looks good, I may know what the right choice is, but what happens if I refuse to do what I'm being asked to do when I know it's wrong? Well, let's just think about his situation once again. Notice, she spoke to Joseph day after day. He would not listen to her, to lie beside her, to be with her. You know what that's eventually going to do? That's eventually going to make her angry, which of course we see it eventually does. Now, picture yourself as a slave where your masters like you. Not a great situation to be in, but could be a lot worse. Now imagine yourself in a position where one of your masters has a vendetta against you. that is one of the most dangerous positions you could be in. Especially in the ancient world, there were no protections for slaves. Even later on, as we talked about in the Greek and Roman Empire under slavery and their culture, there were at least some protections, but there were very few in the very ancient world of Egypt. So he knows, surely, if he continues to refuse her advances, eventually she's going to be angry. And she has all the power in the world to lash out against him. She takes the tack of false accusations. But there are plenty of other ways she could have gotten him in trouble. Plenty of other ways she could have hurt him. And yet he still chose to say no. We see this same recurrent theme in many other stories. Again, true stories. I'm using that because of the style in which it is told. Think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Very similar situation. They've been taken captive. They are essentially slaves of Babylon. They are asked to bow down and do homage to an image that the king has made. We don't know what the image was of. Some have speculated it was of himself. But whatever the case, they refuse. And they know what's going to happen. In fact, the king has already set the punishment for what's going to happen, but even so, they know they are not the ones who have any power in this situation, at least not from a human standpoint. They know that if they refuse, the one who does have power is not going to like them anymore. So far, they've been favorably treated. In fact, if you go back to Daniel chapter 1, they actually were getting along pretty well. They actually did, once again, like Joseph, seem to be a bright spot. And now they know if they refuse, this is all going to change. And they probably won't live. And yet, we know the response. God, our God, is able to save us from the furnace, they say. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to serve your gods, O king. Esther, we have something similar. Esther is, in many ways, little more than a slave of the king. She is chosen among all these women to be the king's toy. But she's the one who gets the promotion from that to being a queen. Still not a whole lot better if you look at the practices of the Persians. She has more power now, surely, but as we saw with the last queen, she can be deposed in whatever way he sees fit. Nonetheless, when it comes down to her people being in jeopardy, after Mordecai helps her to see the situation and her responsibility, she knows this is not a good outcome either way. She's a Jew, so if the plans that Haman has put in place go ahead, she is probably going to suffer with the rest of them. But if she tries to intervene, now the king, who has seen her favorably before, is going to see her potentially as one who is breaking the rules by entering his presence without an invitation. And yet, Esther resolves to go to the king, uninvited, against the law. And she says, if I perish, I perish. In all of these cases, the right thing is to refuse. But you know that if you refuse, it's not going to go well. This is not a winning strategy in any human sense, anyway, from a human perspective. And we sometimes find ourselves in similar situations. Sometimes a parent, a spouse, an employer, someone who has a great deal of influence, or even in a sense, a great deal of power over me, sometimes they will pressure me to do something wrong. And I know if I refuse, there's going to be consequences. Those consequences may even be terrifying. I don't know that any of us might suffer death in those situations, but especially in some of the economic circumstances we've been in, if you refuse to do what your employer wants you to do, for example, that you know to be unethical, being out of a job is no joke. That's not a situation, that's not a scenario but seems to have a good outcome. The consequences can certainly be terrifying. But let's look at the other side. Just for the sake of argument, what happens if I say yes? What happens if I'm put in one of these lose-lose situations, but I go along with what I know to be not the right thing, but let's just play it out for a moment. Let's go back to Joseph's circumstance. What happens if he had said yes? Number one, he's a slave, right? He can make the excuse, well, I didn't have any choice in the matter. He can make the excuse, well, what else am I going to do? It seems like, certainly my family has abandoned me. It seems like God's abandoned me. I just got to look out for my best interests. Plenty of excuses he could have used. If Potiphar's dumb enough to leave his wife who has this mindset alone with me, well, then he gets what's coming to him. All sorts of things, all sorts of justifications. Notice, he's left all that he has in Joseph's charge. He has no concern about anything but the food that he eats. It seems at least plausible that Joseph could have gone along with Potiphar's wife, and maybe Potiphar never would have even been the wiser. But notice the other implication of this. Let's say both of your masters, your master and his wife, they both are favorably disposed towards you. We've already seen that. But now you've got one of them that really likes you. I don't mean to be flippant or crass, but isn't this how a lot of people have gained power in a whole lot of different settings, whether it be in a royal court, whether it be in a household setting like this, whether it be in various industries or business environments? There's a lot of power that can be had in using the appeals of the flesh to get someone to like you. Because what happens when you use that to gain someone's favor? Oh yeah, it can be risky, especially if people find out, but if you do favors for them, they usually do favors for you. Think about all Joseph might have stood to gain. While she is in an ancient society where women did not have as much access to wealth and power as they do now, she still has some influence. She still has ways of maybe even getting him promoted further, maybe convincing Potiphar, to hire him out to other people because of his skill, maybe allowing him some more freedoms. Maybe eventually there was a possibility. Again, we don't know a whole lot about the ancient Egyptian laws, but maybe there was a possibility he could at some point gain his freedom with a powerful benefactress like Potiphar's wife. Certainly it came with some risks, and certainly it was the wrong thing to do. But from a human standpoint, weighing the pros and cons, maybe this is the better choice. Maybe this is the lesser of the two evils. From a purely practical point of view. Once again, he has her attention. He is now being put in some ways in a very powerful position. Now, for the first time, he has something someone else wants. Once again, we see this play out in other ways. Israel finds themselves at the borders of the promised land in Numbers 14. They send out the spies. The spies come back and say, this is not a good situation we put ourselves in. If we go into this land, it is full of warriors. We're a bunch of escaped slaves. We're not professional warriors. We're not trained for this. We don't have walled cities. We don't have siege engines. We don't have masters of warfare. Well, they were slaves in Egypt. But what would you rather be? A slave who's alive or a soldier who's dead? Neither situation's good, but they say, let's opt for the other one. This seems like at least it has a glimmer of hope in it. At least it has a potential upside. Let's go back to Egypt. We see the same thing, not necessarily thought out, but a similar attitude with the disciples. Disciples who just a few hours earlier had promised Jesus, if you die, we're going to die right beside you. Now, granted, they still think we're starting a revolution here. They still think we're establishing an earthly kingdom of God. But nonetheless, that was their resolve. Until Jesus proves he's not going to fight. Now, all of a sudden, they're in a tough situation. Well, yeah, we know it's right to stick with Jesus. We still believe in him, but he's not fighting. He's not doing what we think he's going to do. Would I rather be a dead disciple of Jesus or run for my life? Doing the wrong thing in a scenario like this, it may be risky. We're not saying that it's all an upside, but it still might seem more promising than the alternative. I hope we realize that in these situations. Joseph's situation, these other examples that we're giving, yeah, there's not a good choice to make. But the wrong choice seems, at least in some ways, like it's potentially better. Like we might be better off. If we're thinking purely practically, purely selfishly, when we're in one of these scenarios, and if you've been in one of these scenarios before, you know exactly how strong the appeal is. It might seem more promising to do the wrong thing. I can always make it right later. I can always make up for it later. At least I'll be alive. At least I'll have a job. Whatever the rationale is. Because neither choice seems good. Surely God wouldn't want me to just lose my life. Surely God wouldn't want me to put myself in difficult situations. Surely God wouldn't want me to lose the ability to provide for my family, and on and on and on and on. So let's think about it. Is it worth it? When we are faced with a lose-lose scenario, it seems. When it seems like the option that, yeah, okay, maybe technically it's wrong, but surely it's justifiable, and maybe it actually has a potential good outcome, whereas the other one doesn't seem to have any good outcome at all. Is it worth it if we do the right thing anyway? Is it worth it if we stick to our guns? Is it worth it if we are that unyielding, unreasonable, as the world would probably say? Is it worth it to do the right thing in the face of those odds? The world would certainly say no. Time and time again, God assures us the answer is yes. We already said what happens eventually to Joseph. He's kicked out, not just kicked out, he's put into prison. It's a wonder he wasn't executed. I can't help but thinking that within this situation, it's possible Potiphar isn't fully convinced by his wife, but again, that's pure speculation. You would think that he would have been executed on the spot, but who knows what all the scenarios were. Nonetheless, Potiphar's angry, as makes sense that he would be, and puts him in prison. Doesn't seem like it's worth it. What good came out of that situation in the short term? The Jews returned. King of Persia allowing them to return to the promised land after they've been led away into captivity. They are led by people like Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple. They are doing everything right, being fully subject to the king of Persia, and their enemies send letters to the king saying, hey, these people are planning a rebellion. It's almost like they would have been better off just rebelling. If they're going to be accused of rebelling anyway, they're doing the right thing and they're still being accused of doing the wrong thing. Jesus never did anything against the law of Moses, against the legal codes of the Jews, certainly not against the legal codes of the Romans. But it kind of seems like he might as well, doesn't it? Because that's exactly what he was convicted of. Violating the laws of the Jews and the laws of the Romans. If I'm going to be accused of it anyway, why don't I just do it? Oops, went a little too far. Once again, we can find ourselves sometimes in that same situation. Maybe we make the right decision in a tough situation, and then immediately after, it seems we still suffer the consequences as if we made the wrong decision. I've heard heartbreaking stories from people who have tried to counsel broken marriages, where one spouse or the other is jealous and suspicious. Maybe nothing even has happened in terms of unfaithfulness in the marriage, but a spouse is treating their spouse as if they are unfaithful. I remember particularly, don't know if I've shared this before, a counselor telling me about a tragic experience he had with a husband who, with tears in his eyes, said to the counselor, "She believes I've cheated on her all this time. She won't be convinced by anything. Why don't I just go ahead and do it? I mean, what am I gaining by not being unfaithful to my spouse at this point? She won't believe me. She won't listen." And that's how it feels sometimes. In any of these situations, sometimes it feels like even when we do the right thing, it doesn't matter. We're still treated like we've done wrong. And that's when we have to remember Jesus. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. We look at all of those accounts we looked at. Israel, as they're rebuilding after they come back from captivity, yeah, they're accused, but eventually they're exonerated before the king and allowed to rebuild the temple. Jesus, yes, he is accused and convicted and executed, and therefore able to accomplish the greatest victory that mankind has ever known. Joseph, yes, accused, yes, imprisoned, yes, even forgotten in prison by those he helped to get out of prison, but eventually raised to second in command in all of Egypt. Now, make no mistake, Jesus doesn't promise us that the reward that we have will be a reward on this earth. Sometimes it will happen that way. Sometimes we will be cleared of all of the accusations that we have endured in whatever situation we might find ourselves in. Sometimes that will happen before others. Sometimes we can breathe a sigh of relief and say, finally, people know the truth. I was speaking with a friend just the other day. There had been a difficult situation in their family, and they finally found someone who saw what was happening because it was something that no one had noticed. Wrong that was being done. Everyone thought he was the one who was, had the wrong perspective. And finally someone else saw it. And it brought him to tears. Finally someone else sees what I see. Finally I don't feel like I'm the only one. I'm alone in seeing the truth. We're not promised that that will happen while we're here. It often does. We are promised that we will have a reward in heaven if we do the right thing. Because you see, when it's a lose-lose scenario, supposedly, it's a lose-lose scenario because our perspective is only tied to this world. That's the only way it's lose-lose. We win if we do the right thing. But we win only if we understand where our true loyalties, where our true goal lies. It's not here. Our reward will be great in heaven. It might seem like I'd be better off giving in. I'll get blamed anyway. That often is the case. Children growing up, what do they say? That's not fair. And parents, so tongue-in-cheek, want to respond, well, life is not fair, right? And it's true. Life isn't fair. Might seem like I'd be better off just giving in. But God will reward me for doing the right thing. May not be here, may be. But however it happens, in this life or the next, I will get my reward. It'll happen. And if I rest in that faith, that will be what allows me to make the right decision. So when you feel like you're in a lose-lose scenario, when you feel like you might as well just give in to sin, remember how Joseph won. He won a lose-lose scenario, so to speak. He won by doing the right thing, trusting in a God who, again, from our perspective, he knew very little about. But what he knew, he trusted. What he knew, he maintained faith in. And that's how Joseph won. And that's how we can win. If we can help you in any way this morning, we always stand ready to do that. We face a lot of difficult situations in life. But if we help one another, we can win together. If we can help you, let us know as we stand and sing.
Someday you'll stand at the bar on high.
Someday you're